Welcome to the BPD Bunch. I'm your host, Xannie, and today I'm here with Carys, Madhurima, Raf, and Solène. Where in the world is everyone coming from today?
Coming from beautiful Southern Ontario, Canada.
I'm from Kolkata in India.
I'm from Australia, Melbourne.
I'm from Dubai, UAE.
And I'm coming from New Mexico in the United States. Today we're going to be talking about BPD and grief. If this or other BPD-related topics interest you, please make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss anything. This episode topic was brought to you by our BPD besties over on Patreon. They voted this topic in, and they are behind the scenes watching while we film. It's a special perk, so if that's something that you're interested in, definitely go over to check out our Patreon. Now, I do want to just put the disclaimer out there that grief is a heavy topic. So, if at any point while you're watching this, you need to take a step back to process whatever feelings it brings up for you, that's totally fine. You can pause the video. We'll still be here when you come back. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. Tell us about a story of your experience of grief.
I have two. The first is it's the grief over the loss of my marriages. I'm divorced and legally separated currently. And that was so deep and affected me so much that it actually led to my turnaround point in trying to figure out what was going on with my mental health and why was it's so crippling for me. And then recently with the loss of Lola, who was with me on the pets episode. And, we talked about it on that episode that I said, I don't know how I'm going to be able to handle it. And the way I was able to handle it this time around was so much better. I would actually use the word wonderful because I know how I process emotion now. I have seen it repeated enough times over my life that I'm able to actually make good plans in preparation. And I'm still going through it. I know I'm still actively in recovery from losing her. Also, it is such a more fulfilling process than I ever imagined it could be.
I think for me, grief hits harder when it's in a relationship, whether it's with a person or an animal or anything like that. I guess the biggest one was my, now best friend, but back then partner. We were together for 9 years or 8 years. We got to a point where we realized that we weren't in a romantic relationship anymore. And that was kind of a hard thing to swallow because we spent so many years basically working towards something that neither of us really wanted. And we had to kind of accept that. Grieving, this was years ago. This was probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. The grieving process for me back then was not healthy. I would internalize all my emotions and I would turn them in on myself. It's another way BPD can represent in people. It's not always outwards. For me, it's entirely inwards. And grieving was basically invisible, but the effects of its invisibleness were not. I remember the weekend that we broke up. I just went on a 3-day bender. Went out Friday, came home Sunday, just to avoid the actual grieving process of it all. And I kind of contrasted that to another grief loss of a relationship recently, probably a year and a half or 2 years ago. It felt like it hit just as hard. And instead of going through that version of grieving, I remember actually making decisions no, I want to feel this and I want to grieve it properly. I was out with a few friends. They had a few people around, blah, blah, blah. And I was hey, I just got broken up with. I'm actually not wanting to go out and ignore it. I'm going to go home and cry. And basically just did that. And that felt so much better than running away from it. Yeah, feeling it. Feels bad, but feels good. Oddly enough. Maybe cathartic. Maybe good isn't the right word.
As I was reflecting on stories that I could share. I think there's two different ones. One was the loss of a relationship and one was a death. The first one is I was in a really, really, really dysfunctional relationship. It was with someone who was my favorite person, and I felt addicted to her. At first, it felt like things were great, and then every time we broke up, I started to feel more and more like I was dying, and I would want so badly for us to get back together. But similarly with substances, it was almost like as the relationship went on and when we were together, the greatness wasn't there. The high wasn't really there. It was just like when we were apart, I was in so much pain that I wanted us to be together. And when that relationship finally ended, the grief consumed me. I did not have a break from those emotions really at all for 2 straight years. And what's interesting is that during that time, while I was grieving that loss, I also experienced the death of someone who I had really strong romantic feelings for. And the reaction to that was really different. I cried a lot the first day, and then there was like nothing for 2 weeks, just numb. And then I woke up one day and I felt like I was gonna die. The pain was gonna kill me. And I think that's one of the things that's very interesting for me is that like if a friendship or like a relationship breaks down, the pain is intense and immediate, but when it comes to death, my brain has such a difficult time wrapping itself around it, or I'm afraid of the feelings, that there's usually this period of numbness before it sets in. And that numbness is almost more terrifying than pain, because pain I at least know. The numbness, I always feel like I'm just waiting, like how bad is this going to be when it hits? It's a scary place to be.
I can really relate to the numbness. For me personally, my hardest stories around grief are related to the loss of my grandparents. So my first experience of grief was when my granddad passed away. I was living in London. I just moved to London, and it was very sudden and unexpected. I remember like so clearly getting the call from my dad at the office, and at that moment I wasn't diagnosed with BPD. And I had this deeply rooted belief that I had to be strong. I had to be the strong one. I had to keep it together for my dad, for my grandma, for my auntie, for everybody. And so I remember like I went back to France for the funeral. And it was open coffin in the hospital, and just a few of us, just literally my parents, my grandma, my auntie, my sister around my granddad. And in that moment, my grandma completely broke. Tears. She couldn't hold her own body. So I held her standing. And I remember this so clearly because in that moment, I was like, I cannot show any emotion. I cannot break down. I cannot. So there was so much like holding it in. And like Xannie expressed with the numbness, after that, for weeks, I felt nothing. And I shamed myself in my own head saying, you're not even sad. Like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, you need to be sad. And eventually it just hit me like an absolute tornado. And I was crying. Like, I had to go to the loo in the middle of a meeting because someone said something. I can't even remember what they said, but it just brought up a memory, and then I would be like at home cooking. I would like it just kept coming in those moments, and that was really, really hard because I felt like I couldn't tell anybody because I needed to be strong. I needed to be seen as the strong one. Fast forward to the loss of my grandma very recently, or it feels like yesterday. We were so close, and gosh, I love her so much, and it was very different. And it's probably going to come up in how I tell the story because I had been diagnosed with BPD. I was much more in touch with my emotions and open to them, and knowing that if I let myself feel the feels, they will come, they will go, and it's absolutely okay. And there's no judging. If I don't cry in that moment, it's okay. If I do cry in that moment, it's okay. Whatever comes is absolutely welcome. And yeah, her funeral was, like you said, Carys, there's this beauty, this sacredness, this connection, even though it's so sad, but it's also magical. And I cried so much, but without any judgment. And that was the main difference, without judgment, without expectations. And, you know, even I noticed other people try to fix it. Like they would see me express so much emotionally. They would be like coming to give me hugs or to say, it's going to be okay. And I'm like, I know, this is my process. And yeah.
Yeah, for me, I have felt like very different kinds of grief when it came to different kind of relationships in my life. I mean, the kind that I felt a lot is the one which was associated with losing my best friends from childhood. It was the result of a very impulsive decision, and I was like, you know, at the rock bottom of my mental health. I was not the best version of myself, but they were also not the best version for me back then. And one thing led to the other, and I made this impulsive decision to cut them off from my life, because back then it was like very black and white, you know. It's like either you get me or you don't, either you treat me right or you don't get to stay in my life. So back then it did not affect me a lot. I mean, I moved on with my life, but grief comes in weird ways. Like maybe when I'm sitting one day in the afternoon and I'll think of something very random and very weird from my school days, and I would want to open my phone and try to text a friend that remember when it happened, and I would feel like I don't have that someone to talk about that anymore. I mean, I can't just go back there and pretend like everything did not go down horribly. So it kind of hits you like you have lost someone permanently from your life, even though they're physically there. So it's a very subtle form of how grief kind of comes and picks me from time to time. And another thing is it's also about my grandfather from my father's side. He died when I was 15 years old. I've been living with my grandparents since I was born. So they were there all the time. And he was, you know, he was like a very knowledgeable person. I mean, he was a professor in history. I mean, to me, it seemed like he was born like years back, like in 1930s. And he had seen like, you know, like our independence struggles and everything. And he had walked through it. So he would tell me stories, and I would go with my history book and learn things from him. And his passing was very sudden. Like he had this kidney infection, and within like a day or two, it was over. And I remember at the time I went through the whole process. I mean, I was a kid. I mean, it felt devastating, but also it did not feel real. I mean, it felt like he's gone, but he will come back. I mean, it was like a long process of denial. And with time, I think the grief never went away. And an added version of the grief I felt to that is that when I realized that I am never gonna have him in my life, talk about all those things. I mean, I'm never gonna learn more about him. I mean, I had so much to like know about him, and I'm never gonna do that. So like this heavy feeling, I mean, I am grieving him, but I'm also grieving something that was not there. I mean, the opportunity that is missed. So that's like, that's there. And I don't know if it's ever going to go away. So
I can really relate to that. Like for me growing up, I never felt like I related to my parents. They're very more internalized with their emotions, and I feel a lot of grief over the loss of the connection that I feel like I missed out on with my mom's mom, who I didn't realize until like she was already, you know, on her way out of the world, that she was really a lot like me, like really emotional, really over the top. And that same like missed opportunity at the time when she really could have done a lot of things with me, I was so selfish and self-absorbed. I didn't really think about her story or her life until it was too late, you know? I can't go back and change that, but, you know, I think about her all the time. I have a voice recording, actually. She did something real for our whole family. She made like a book of recipes. And when she was in the hospital, I actually asked her if she would read them all out and like some directions and stuff. So I'm glad at least at that point I had the thought to like capture that and hold on to it, she has this recipe for pound cake, and this is my favorite quote of hers from the thing. She goes, "Yeah, this is my recipe for inexpensive pound cake. I always used to make it when I felt broke." When I felt broke, that was not was broke, felt broke. When she felt broke, she would make herself this cake. I don't know why I relate to that, but I miss her so much, and I miss the connection over emotion that we could have had if I hadn't just been so focused on myself.
Listening to everybody's stories and seeing that there's grief of missing a person like that, or a relationship, something that used to be there that is no longer there, and just that fact is enough to cause grief. But on top of that, there's grieving what can never be. I guess as like a overarching thing over all of that is this idea of delayed emotional processing, which is something I have as well. In the past, when we have experienced delayed emotional processing, we have felt shame over it. The one thing I'm hearing from everybody who has identified that that was a part of their past is that now in the present, we no longer feel bad about not feeling. We understand that we're going to feel. It just may not be right now. And that's how it was when we lost Lola. So Lola was my emotional support animal. She was over 16 when she died. We put her down. We had her humanely euthanized. Afterwards, Jer says to me, "I'm really surprised at how well you took that." And I said, "Well, remember, I have delayed emotional processing, so I'm not expecting for it to hit me yet. I'm expecting for it to hit me in about 3 days." And he was like, "Oh, okay." I'm like, "So that's why I booked off work on Monday." Like I had enough, like I planned ahead. I was able to cope ahead. Like at 45 years old now, like I'm able to see where the wheels have come off my life enough times to be able to start planning for it effectively and living the way that most people live naturally.
How has BPD interacted with how you've experienced grief?
I think for me, if it's being grief in terms of like relational grief, the self-worth part is probably the part that kind of hits the hardest, because some of it goes like, oh, if I was worthy, I wouldn't be feeling this grief, or that thing wouldn't have happened. And then that can kind of spiral in on itself. And then also when I've needed to grieve like a change in something, either like occupationally or again, relationships, that loss of identity, some of that is like a natural thing to feel because you are losing a part of like, what made up a good part of your life. But the BPD would push that feeling to an extreme, and it would kind of make grieving a little bit harder because internally so much of my resources would be dealt with the extreme that the BPD would push the other emotions to. So I wouldn't even be able to get to that sort of like fundamental thing that I quote unquote should be grieving. It would almost, intensify and distract in a lot of ways.
If I'm understanding you correctly, are you saying that BPD might like intensify your emotion about something else to distract you from the grief that you feel about a particular thing?
Yeah.
So it's like you're on like a diverted path, basically?
Yeah, so like I could be grieving something like, a loss of a person. They've died or whatever, something like that. And if a part of me was like tied up in that, like a part of me and the part of us, how I saw myself, I might not grieve the loss of the actual person. The identity, the self-identity loss could be so exaggerated that I look at replacing that first in whichever way, and then eventually maybe get to the actual grieving of the person or the job or the thing or the time or the place.
That's so interesting because I feel like I have done a similar diverting, but I've done the diverting thing, but in a totally different way, which is like, I come up with a whole bunch of different reasons why I shouldn't be as upset as I am. I wasn't as close to this person as other people are. Like, it didn't really matter that much or whatever. And then rage has been historically my number one coping emotion for almost anything. I've noticed that like when real serious losses, especially with deaths, occur, and even with relationships, it's just more more extreme looking when it comes to a death. I seem totally fine. And then somebody says or does something that hurts my feelings, and the amount of rage that I would direct towards them is so disproportionate to the situation, and is mostly due to the grief that I don't feel comfortable expressing, because for some reason, if I do, it means I'm weak and incapable and all these other things. And gosh, like when my grandfather died, I was dating this guy at one point, and I just was so mean to him during that period, because I was so unwilling to face the loss of my grandfather that I was just like angry all the time about things that had nothing to do with his passing. You know, it's like, oh, we're gonna go here and you changed your mind. Poof! Explosion.
Grief for me interacts with all of the 9 symptoms of BPD, and that's why it's so difficult to get through it. And also it comes and goes in waves, and it will be linked to a lot of sensory experiences. I have sensory hypersensitivity, and you know, a sound, a smell, something will trigger a moment, a memory, and it will just like sweep over me. The 3 symptoms that get impacted probably the most, one is the emotion instability, emotion extremes, going from I totally accept, I'm so grateful that I met this person and I really feel like, you know, the joy of knowing them, to like feeling so angry, then feeling so sad, like just the extremes. Second is the going from that to feeling nothing at all, the emptiness. I feel nothing. Am I even alive? Am I breathing? Is something happening? Can someone see me? Like that sensation. And then the self-harm piece. Especially when it's got to do with the loss of a romantic relationship for me, but even friendships. That self-harm piece, I guess, is linked to what you were saying, Raf, about the self-worth. I feel like I don't deserve to be here, and how do I cope anyway with this massive emotion? You know, I just can't. And so it's like hurting my body kind of is the way that I used to cope with that, or try to cope with it in some way.
It's very spread out for me. I don't know if there's any one particular symptom, or even if it's a symptom of BPD per se which gets triggered, but something definitely does. Every time I've felt an, extreme of an emotion, the first reaction was to repress it. And repressed things can only stay bottled up for so long, and used to manifest in me like in ways that I didn't even realize were like, harmful for me. I mean, it kind of became like a self-fulfilling prophecy that I used to destroy my own relationships. Like if I lost a relationship, if I lost a friend, a partner, I would deliberately keep myself from entering into further relationships, and like to stop making friends whatsoever, because I would always tell myself that if you go and do this, it's going to end up in this way anyway, so just don't do it in the first place. And when I failed to repress, I would feel so much shame. I just felt like I should be the logical one, even if it's like, the death of a loved one, or even if it's like somebody leaving. I would not allow myself to be sad, because I just wanted to be the rational one. And even after being in recovery, it kind of got worse at first, because I felt like I should be rationalizing it better now, but it's not happening. I mean, it's kind of becoming worse. So right now, after I've learned that the only way out is through, it makes a lot more sense, because if I've not let myself process through all those emotions, it's never going to go away. It just takes some form. It's either shame, it's either anger, it's either a lot of worthlessness, but it's there in some form. So I just need to process it, to let all of it go.
We've been talking a lot about anger, and anger is a normal grief reaction for a lot of people, right? I don't just do that when it comes to grief. It's like all the time. Like, well, not now anymore, but when I was actively symptomatic, anger was my default response to most emotions I didn't like. So it does make it a little bit difficult now to be like, okay, so if I'm being angry when I'm if I am angry when I'm grieving, is that still a symptom of BPD or not? And I kind of try to focus on it as sort of like the intensity and also in terms of the damage that it does, because I feel like the me now is maybe a little bit snappy, says something a little bit insensitive, versus the me of the past who would scream and yell and break things and throw things and, you know, like run out of the house with, you know, one shoe on, like just totally two different extremes. So I do think that that's just important to clarify that, you know, it's hard to tell where the line is, but there is a difference there. And the other thing is that in terms of like BPD, you know, Madhurima, you were also talking about how it's like, well, I should be able to handle this better now because I'm like more recovered. And this is something that I worked on a lot actually in this past year with my therapist, because my husband and I have had experienced a lot of losses in the last like 6 months. And my husband lost his mother about a month and a half ago. And, you know, he's grieving it and going through it. And he's also like able to go through his day relatively productively. And I started to feel like, what the hell is wrong with me? Like, I'm having a hard time doing anything. Like, I'm so slow. I just want to cry. Like, it wasn't even my mother. It was his mother. What is wrong with me? If it was my mother, I would not be able to get out of bed for a year. I said this to my therapist and she said, you really think it would be that abnormal for you to really struggle with the loss of a parent for a year? And I was like, well, I don't know, compared to some of these other people, yeah, it does seem abnormal. And she was like, it's not. If you are still struggling after a year, that does not mean you still have BPD. I'm having a hard time accepting that because there's a part of my brain that just wants to be like, I'm the problem. But I'm working on accepting that, no, like, you can be really upset about something for a long time, and it is not a symptom of a mental health diagnosis. What are some of your top skills and tips for managing grief as somebody who has BPD?
The only way out is through. Like, literally, that's it. That's my tip. That's my top takeaway. Like, just do the thing. Just feel the feels.
Do the thing.
Go through it however you need to. Give yourself time and space. Like, the fact that I booked a day off from work to deal with the upcoming grief of losing my dog, like being able to recognize that I was going through anticipatory grief and then making plans and to actually go through it. And I feel like I know when I will be done the majority of the grieving process that I'll know that. Like, I know that I'll feel that within me, like, to my core, that, like, I've accepted it, I have given it the appropriate time and space, and now I am moving through it and past it. Like, we have another dog now, but that's Jeremy's dog. Like, he's our family dog too, but like, it's not my soul dog. I'm not ready for that yet. And I knew that. He's fun and I love him to bits. Like, I don't hold any like animosity towards him or anything. There's no like weird feelings against him. He's like 100% my cute fluffy animal. But I know that my heart isn't free yet. And I know that when it is, I'll know it, because I'm allowing myself to go through the process.
Carys, I feel like I'm going to give you props because my therapist does this to me whenever I do this. But knowing when you're going to need help and being able to do that and take that day off. Because being able to like look forward in time and say like, oh, I'm going to need further assistance here, or I'm just going to need more time. That's kind of amazing. So Carys, I'm going to give you props for that because fuck yeah, like, that's really good. I think, yeah, we need to point that out. Now, what I was going to say, I think also if you're having trouble trying to figure out if what's stopping you from going through the process is shame, and finding a way to navigate either around that and realizing that the big emotions that you're going to be going through, you don't need to be ashamed of, because like Xannie said, anger is sometimes a reasonable thing to feel. Well, it is a reasonable thing to feel. And the shame is what's going to stop that from being able to come through in a healthy way until the lid pops off and then it explodes. I think if you can try to find a way to check in with yourself and see if it's shame that's stopping you from going through the grieving process, look into that and then find ways to de-shame yourself.
You know, funny thing is, I'm studying medicine, so we have psychiatry textbooks, and in those textbooks, they have definition of what is typical grief and what is atypical grief, and what is bereavement disorder, and how do you classify different kinds of atypical grief reactions, what is prolonged grief. I mean, they have classified it into like all sorts of things, like you can, grieve for a longer time than normal, you can grieve for a shorter time than normal, you can have different reactions. Like, what if you're not sad, what if you're feeling another kind of reaction? And it's like so hilarious to read about, because you can like classify things in a scientific way any way you can, nobody's stopping you, but that's not how life works. There's no atypical reaction to grief. I mean, there is no like abnormal way to bereave something that you've lost. So I mean, people have different way of coping with things, and even if it's not the healthiest way or like the most appropriate way at this point in time, I would suggest that to not be so extremely hard with yourself, because that will actually bring a lot of shame. It's not going to help you process it. It's just going to make the process harder. There is nothing called normal. Like, everybody has their own definition of normal. Work out what is best for you and go your own way. And like, I think it's very important to know when to ask for help. And it doesn't make you less of a person if you want help to try and process through all of these complicated emotions.
I don't have a ton to add. I think the one thing that I can say for anybody who is like me and, a master emotion phobe, knowing how to access your emotions when you're avoiding them is really helpful. And one of the things that I've noticed is that when I'm avoiding my emotions, I tend not to be in my body so much. So one of the things that is really helpful for me is doing activities that help put me back in my body, usually movement or exercise. So like when my mother-in-law passed away, there were a couple days where I was having a bit of a numbness reaction. And I went to my Zumba dance class and started tearing up in class dancing, because I was finally reconnecting with my body and reconnecting with my feelings. And so the thing I like about movement for reconnecting with your body and your emotions is it doesn't require you to think yourself out of some space. You just have to move. And I think that's one of the things that I really like about that. Similar to what has been said about like shame, but I think like not comparing your reaction to somebody else's. I've definitely fallen into the trap of believing that the amount of emotion somebody feels will be displayed on their face or in their body. And if they are not showing me their emotions, they don't have them. That was just what I thought. And it is not true. And it's really unfair to judge your entire self, comparing yourself to only part of what you can see on somebody else. You have no idea what somebody else is feeling in their body. And, it could be that you do feel more intensely about a situation than somebody else, but it's just important for me to remind myself that just because other people aren't like crying in front of me doesn't mean that they're not really sad. And it doesn't mean that I can't cry just because they're not. And that's hard. It's hard to believe that, but I'm working on it and we'll get there.
You all nailed it. 100%. Feel your feelings. Don't judge your process or anybody else's. There's no timeline or expiry date on grief, and reach out for help if you need it. That's it for me.
Thank you everyone so much for watching. We hope you got a nugget of wisdom to take with you on your journey. Thank you again to our BPD besties on Patreon for voting for this topic. Whew, this one was a doozy. There's a lot of big feelings, and we will definitely revisit this topic because, as we have discovered over the course of our conversation, there's a lot more to say on grief. Friday we'll be back to answer a question from one of our BPD besties all about grief over the life we would have had if we didn't have BPD. And until then, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye!
Peace.
Bye.